Hello, everybody. Welcome to this new format that we are planning for 2026 at Cannamonitor. As you are well aware, one of our most used products is our monthly brief, where we do a recap of news in the international cannabis market. And so this year, I've decided to also create it in webinar format, so maybe you can access it as well in our platform, or otherwise you can just, if it's better for you, you can just listen through the main news of the month. I am still experimenting with it, so please do not hesitate to ask any feedback. My idea is to make it a dynamic format, so make it fairly quick and to the point without much fluff, just straight intelligence. um, because it takes quite a lot of effort every month to put together this recap of news with over 200 pages. For our subscribers in our Essentials platform, this is also available. Our monthly briefs are available, not just the short version that we send to everybody, but also this full recap with over 200 news from over 30 countries that we share every month to our paying subscribers. And as well, some of the other features of our platform is access to a whole news dashboard broken down in a variety of ways, by country, by just regulations. For medical, you can look for specific countries, and also you have access to some of our databases that we put here, and some of our deeper analysis that we don't have space to share publicly, for instance, is only available to subscribers here. So for instance, we have our M&A tracker database with all the deals and all the intelligence that is available here for our subscribers. This is just a short overview of it. Or for instance, our latest analysis on the Czech Republic is also available here, always in more detail than what we can share elsewhere. So without any other ado, let's go straight into the January newsletter. This is the full version that our subscribers get, and of course, first we have some recap of the main movements in terms of M&A, financial results that can give you a quick grasp of the most important developments in the month. And then the nitty-gritty is, of course, the sections of state by state, country by country, for, as you can see, a lot of countries. And particularly for the largest ones, let's say Australia, we have the regulatory section, the market section, and the science section, breaking down the specific news this way. So let's start at the top. In the USA, we are still on the aftermath of the executive order by Trump in December, the rescheduling of cannabis. However, we are seeing still not a lot of movement in terms of, for instance, some news highlighted that banks are still not willing to work with cannabis companies. So this is an example of why it's likely going to take a little bit longer than it seemed to get moving. Also, in parallel to the rescheduling announcement, which would be more, of course, on the medical side of things, there was the developments on the hemp sector with proposed crackdown, which now, though, it seems that because there's been some pushback against it, let's say, from both sides of the aisle, there are some proposals to at least delay the implementation of this hemp ban bill, which threatens to completely decimate the hemp industry in the States, to at least delay it one year, in this case, to November 2028. So this implementation is still something that needs to be discussed. Some other news that we cover, for instance, on the regulatory side, is the Trump made a big emphasis on the fact that CBD would be covered through Medicaid, and as MJB's reports, This is something that's not going to be straightforward. It has some regulatory process ongoing. Some other news that we saw is, of course, that most of the users are against this rescheduling because, let's say, it's true that now most states in the US have already legalized dispensary access at the at their level, but still in some of the states that have more limiting regulations, let's say Texas, for instance, hemp derived products, even THC, but hemp derived, is still one of the main pathways to access cannabis products. So it makes sense that most of the consumers are against limiting. We still most of the news for let's say the state agencies that usually report on their annual revenue figures and so on, we still don't have all of the data. It's true there's been some commentary lately saying that perhaps 2025 was going to be the first year that the regulated dispensary-driven market in the US would see a drop in sales. This is, to my knowledge, is still not entirely clear because it's true that price compression in markets like Michigan, for instance, has potentially made a drop in revenue apparent, which doesn't mean a drop in volume, by the way. However, some of the markets, let's say mostly New York, are still growing, some of these less mature markets, and this is perhaps can moderate the drop seen in other markets. So the annual report by the OCM in New York is out with the data only until November, so we still don't have the full picture of the year. However, it points to a very very exciting trend in New York, which was very slow to come through. If you remember, there were a few years with the licensing process and so on that there was much discussion and not much to show for, but this seems to be finally unlocking a lot of growth in New York, which is of course a market with a huge potential, no? And it's already at over 1.5 billion in sales in the last year. This is only 11 months, so it's not going to be still 2 billion, but it looks like very soon the New York market's going to cross the 2 billion threshold, which is exciting news for that market, and it's now the market that's driving the most growth in the US regulated pathways, together with Ohio and a couple others. So we look forward in the next month probably to having a more definite picture about the numbers in the US market, which are they are still going to be hovering around 32 billion in sales through dispensaries in 2025, which is exciting. Then there's also some private providers of data that we also cover in our briefs. This is an example by Fatnax magazine. They report on Hoodie Analytics data, and for instance, this analysis is only of 3.5 gram flour, and I thought it was interesting because, of course, the largest markets in overall sales are not necessarily the largest for a particular product format. So if we have a certain strategy that's limited to a particular product formats, we might be interested. We need this granular view on how the different markets are actually shaping up. And in this case, for instance, Florida leads in 3.5 grams in sales, whereas other markets that you would expect, like Michigan and California, are trailing Florida for this specific product format. And also in terms of the brands, we see a little bit of different brands than the ones we would see for, of course, for pre-rolls or for edibles or vapes, etc. So interesting data that we love to track, and this is what I like about our newsletter, that we can also use second-hand data, and this gives us a lot of a broader perspective, let's say, than if we were just to report our primary data that Cannamonitor collect, which is, of course, our primary focus and what we do for clients. But there's the world is very big. The cannabis industry is starting to become a huge industry globally. So we need a lot of data points to get the full perspective. Okay, so this is it for the USA, which usually it's in our top three markets per month, together with Germany, which of course since legalization in April 2024 has also been attracting massive attention. We have been for the last few months following this amendment to the MedCanG, which was voted in December in the both houses of parliament, but now the proceedings are still ongoing. The possibility to amend some of the contents of this amendment is still open. And actually, some exciting development, I would say, from the last few weeks only, is the fact that some cracks are starting to show within the CDU, which is the conservative ruling party in Germany, which was when they went on to win the last elections and they managed to form a government. They were pretty much against what the previous government reformed, claiming all sorts of usual narrative surrounding cannabis that trying to relate it to all sorts of criminal behaviors that maybe that's for scholars to determine, but perhaps sometimes opportunistically you might want to link the fact that now you don't get a penalty for using cannabis, relating that to other social issues on the city, but on the country. But now it seems that the cracks are showing within the CDU, and even though they are still pretty much for some restrictions, particularly on the prescribing side, it seems, for instance, that the mail order ban is probably doesn't look like it's going to be enacted as it was intended. And also this idea that you can limit prescribing, teleprescribing, but just for the German doctors, whereas doctors from other countries in the EU can still be giving out prescriptions like in the same way as now. It's completely it's not loyal to the German doctors, and also these voices within the CDU, not only in the opposition or in the SPD parties, are starting to be really saying that some limitations are necessary, but not as much as it was intended before, which of course we celebrate. In terms of the market developments in Germany in the month, something this is the wavering of the CDU party, according to one top pharmacy source in the country. And something interesting for market data is, of course, first the proliferation of products during the year, because many new entrants got into the market and distributors continued to expand their portfolios, launch new brands or new sub-brands targeting other segments, particularly the budget segment of products. So according to this report by Bloomberg, it's over 700 SKUs for flower, and a significant decrease in prices. Of course, we need to perhaps give a caveat here, because when we are working with data from a particular market operator, we cannot just take it at face value, and we don't. And of course, there's many ways that you can splice the data. So for instance, if you have the same flower SKUs registered under different potencies, you might count them together or in different ways. So I think if you go into the Flows website, you probably have over 1,200 products right now, SKUs, whereas Bloomberg is saying something north of 700. But still, I think this report that they produce periodically is very interesting. I translated it using AI, so we can read it even without speaking German. And it's good because it combines some data from other third-party surveys and other sources, with also their own surveys with their own patients, and also some market data that I assume comes also from their own data. So for instance, this is from a survey they conducted in July, and it's an interesting question they asked to consumers, like what would happen if telemedicine was to be restricted. And we get that 42% of the respondents say I'm going to go back to the illegal market. And actually, this is an argument that then you can hear within the CDU and within this, it has really affected the political attitudes to how to do this amendment of the MEDCANG. And this is always, it shows that lobbying and advocacy is something that really helps. You need to be doing this intellectual work and this data generation work of generating arguments for legalization. It's not just, we cannot just take it for granted. Of course, to us in the industry, it might sound very obvious that if you limit regulated pathways to access, you're gonna just throw people back into the dark alleys of the cities or into the illicit marketing, whatever form it takes. But if you have the data, it's way easier to convince the politicians that they should really think it through, even if their first instinct is against cannabis. Even from a perspective of public order, criminal law, etc., it still can make sense to have regulated access rather than the opposite. And I believe these arguments have managed to convince the CDU in part. But the data that I enjoyed from this report is particularly the number of flowers, which, as you can see, the legalization is more or less fell around here, and they estimate that there was, let's say, under 300 flower products in the market back then. And of course, during the rest of 2024 and the beginning of 2025, there was a big explosion of SKUs in the market, and some of the distributors that managed to increase their portfolios the most actually saw the most growth as well. And this was the case, for instance, of Remexian, that got acquired in probably the largest M&A deal of the last year. Was bought by High Tide, by a Canadian retailer. We see also in this data that the second half of 2025 kind of breaks a little bit this trend as well, and we see a little bit more flat in the number of products. And also, very interestingly, this has had this supply dynamics, together with perhaps a certain cooling of the demand explosion that followed legalization, has meant that the cheap products have increased over time their share of the market. The categories that Bloomberg uses are between under €6 is considered very cheap, which is this green, this very light green here. And we see that at the time of legalization, these very cheap products that were retailing for under €6 per gram were under 10% of the market, more or less. And now, according to them, which again, this might involve their own specific patient base, not necessarily everybody's. I'm not claiming this is a market signal, but it is certainly a signal for instance, the more platform telemedicine-driven sector of the market, which I would say there's a broad agreement that has significantly compressed prices. And this chart, I think, shows this wonderfully. Also, in the virtual disappearance of the very expensive category, over €15 per gram, but even the expensive, let's say the premium, before it used to be in the first days of legalization around €12. Now €12 is already ultra premium, and perhaps €10 is the next €10 is the next premium threshold, let's say. And this, of course, forces as well operators to be forces them to be way more efficient and to survive in a context of tightening margins, for sure. And I think there are some ways out of it that we have seen in other international markets that are more mature, but still it's also to a certain degree unavoidable to have some commoditization, I would say, in a maturing market like Germany. So we still keep following the German market with a lot of interest, of course. Let's see, very soon we're expecting the data for Q4 2025 in imports, and let's see if it surpassed the 180 tons mark for the last year, because at the end there were some problems with the import quotas, INCB quotas, and so on. So let's see. And also the the first signals for the momentum of the market in 2026. Everybody, I would say, even though everybody understands that there's perhaps some winds facing we're facing some headwinds in the German market. I think pretty much everybody understands as well that it's as we showed in a recent webinar, it's likely over half of the international market right now, so very important to the success of the global market and the European in particular. Canada is another market that is always on the top of our priority list and that we focus. And I think what we just mentioned in the case of Germany is also the relevant thing to say for Canada, since Canada represents 50% of the imports to the German market directly. But if we were to account as well products that are rerouted through Portugal or Czechia or Switzerland or Malta, etc., it's likely more like 2/3 of products going into the German market. So the dynamics of international trade and imports, not only in Germany but also Australia and other important markets, are going to be very, very relevant to Canadian operators, which have been over the last year. I would say many of these operators have started focusing more and more on exportation. So the figures for 2025 are likely close to 250 tons or even more of Canadian exports. Considering their own domestic market, let's say about 800 tons, it's already a very, very significant part of the business for Canadian LPs. The fact that they are able to export and usually doing so at a higher price and with better margins and with no taxes or not as many taxes as they have in their domestic market. So it was a significant opportunity that some companies in particular have managed to garner, and others are trying as well. There's on the regulatory perspective for Canada, I would say provinces like BC and Alberta, they are doing from the public institutions, they are promoting the industry with different initiatives, even though Health Canada had in their agenda to legalize, to design pathways for CBD outside the dispensaries in their domestic market. So maybe allowing the convenience stores or other types of retail stores to market CBD products. And this has been this regulatory proposal has been a little bit forgotten from the priority list as StratCan is reporting in their plan for 2025-2027. So let's see. There was some talks a couple of years ago that this could drive more, be a driver of growth in the Canadian market. Even though we must say the data in volume is fairly good. The latest official data from Health Canada, which I believe are up to Q2 2025, showed a 20% increase in volumes compared to 2024, which is pretty good for a maturing market, I would say. And also the data in November, it's true there was a public sector strike in BC that put some strain on sales on the particular province and even dragged a little bit down the national average. But still, the data that is reported by Statistics Canada shows still, in this case, a 6.6% increase and almost 500 million Canadian dollars in sales per month, which points, of course, to the Canadian market as a clear second largest cannabis market globally in regulated terms, for sure. Australia is also a market we like to cover a lot, and also in recent days, there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of pressure, a lot of articles on the press criticizing some of the practices by telemedicine companies, and TGA and regulators have been also acting against some of these more dubious marketing practices. And even in this month, there were some extra fines and so on that we reported. But the consultation that the TGA began in the last year is now coming to the end, and now they are beginning a series of stakeholder workshops with involved entities to discuss more concrete regulatory steps. Let's see, because again, similar to Germany, the first position by the more prohibitionist sectors tends to be fairly strict against against the rules, particularly in the case of telemedicine. But perhaps the stakeholders, and particularly the industry associations, which have been doing some joint initiatives recently, etc., can do some lobbying efforts that manage to avoid the more dramatic scenarios, and perhaps tightening the aspects that if they need to be tightened, but not necessarily scrap the whole access regime, which has otherwise been fairly successful for Australia, in my opinion. And this is starting to be shown in some of the movements, the market movements. There were already some acquisitions and some big investment occasions in the last year, and 2026 has started with the biggest one yet, which would be the reverse takeover of Little Green Pharma by Canatrek. Little Green Pharma is a public company in the ASX, whereas Canatrek used to be a private company, but together they would have revenues of over 100 million Australian dollars a year, which is significant. It would put it as one of the largest cannabis companies outside North America. There's only a couple of companies in the German market that could rival these revenues in the right now. And also, it would also position, it's a news that matters not only for Australia, where Canatrek has been the largest distributor for a couple of years, but also for the European market, where Little Green Pharma has some assets because they acquired a few years ago the Canopies facility in Denmark. So they have that Danish asset that they can use for Germany, for the UK, and for a variety of European markets. This M&A deal hasn't been closed yet. As you can see, Canatrek their shareholders would become the dominant shareholders of Little Green Pharma. There's some, let's say, some synergies in the type of products that they have in the market, and their assets as well within Australia. So this is something that I'm quite excited to keep following. And I would say that it's not this more, even though Australia hasn't managed to export a lot until now, it's been a little bit more than 1 ton a year. And if I'm not wrong, most of it, or a big part of it, it's AMTG's exports to Germany and similar cases. Also, some cross-Tasman trade with New Zealand. But even though from the Australian products are not reaching that much the international markets, I would still say that Australian companies are certainly becoming more active in international markets. I would say in the UK, there's companies like Montu, but now, for instance, Bioxine has just announced an investment in the UK. They have announced some supply deals in Central America as well. So there's a couple of companies that are doing well in international markets from Australia, and this is very exciting. I don't want to be taking too long, but just a couple more countries before calling it quits. I wanted to make it half an hour, but I hope you don't have a problem if we go 5 minutes more. In the case of the UK, for many, many months, there's been a lot of patient complaints that the police, that they were having problems with the police when having their prescriptions with them on the street, not only using, even just having them, because most police officers were completely ignorant about what the law says in the UK, which of course it was legalized in 2018. So we celebrate that there has been a new guidance for the police forces in England and Wales that gives some more concrete instructions for police on how to deal with that. It shows definitely a trend of normalization in the British landscape. Other than that, there's been some movements on the CBD novel foods, which of course the UK has been at the forefront of that. But the bilateral negotiations with the EU as well as the specific developments in Scotland might imply some delay in the final approvals for these novel food applications that will allow food supplements with CBD to be marketed under more normal conditions until now. And in terms of the market, we didn't have many news on this month. However, I would mention always the clinic sector, very dynamic in the UK. Even now, recently in February already, there's been an announcement of a new clinic created by Grow Group, which points to that even now that it might seem a little bit more mature than a couple of years ago, there's still interest. And particularly what I'm seeing a lot is clinics launching specific schemes targeting, for instance, more budget subscription products, or even targeting, let's say, veterans and particular demographics. So it certainly gives patient reviews. There's a lot of movement that we follow with a lot of interest every month, and I have big hopes also for the UK in 2026. And actually, I'm going to be traveling there for Cannabis Europa, so look forward to meeting the British industry in person as well. In the case of Israel, we got the final data for 2025, which the regulator publishes fairly quickly. This first graph shows the patient authorizations in blue, but also the patients that are accessing using prescriptions in Israel in orange. And what this shows is that after the October 7 attacks, there was a surge a small surge in patient authorizations, which was said to be due mostly to PTSD and trauma patients. Then the reforms kicked in that actually mandated that for certain conditions, chronic pain, if I'm not wrong, instead of having a patient authorization, each patient would require prescriptions by their specialty doctor. And this is why this orange thing has appeared. For a while, only the blue thing was reported, and this is why it seems like the drop was there was like a big drop in patients. But actually, when you account for the patients actually getting prescriptions, you see that the market has been more or less stabilized in terms of number of patients. However, the international trade, I think, is where the big story is. As you remember, a couple of years ago, there was a lot of oversupply in the Israeli market with 100 tons, if you included their own production, the imports, the ballooning inventories, etc., etc. This situation has more or less been overcome. And actually, this year was record for importation in Israel, which had been hovering slightly north of 20 tons for the last 5 years. This year has been a record of 30 tons. And actually, if we look at the month-by-month data, we see that December is 6 tons, which is a remarkable increase in the imports. However, we should still consider that most of the products even though there's more appetite and better prices perhaps for imported products, most of the supply in Israel remains domestic, with some growers that have been mostly supplying their own market, even though, as we see on the export data, this has started ramping up as well. The figures had been pretty abysmal, even though the intention to be an international supplier has been there for many years. However, we see that this is the year where that shows a clear breakthrough over 10 tons and almost 11 tons of imports in the Israeli market, which is really significant. I believe Greenfields, one producer, is responsible for a big chunk of that, but still it shows to a lot of opportunities for players in Israel. Let's see. We will continue to to track it during 2026, particularly because Israel I would consider a more mature market in the international landscape, not perhaps compared to North America, but compared to Germany, for instance, very clearly so. And we are seeing some of the, after many years of price compression, like I said before, price compression is never going away, but there are some premium offerings and some more differentiated offerings that are appearing in the market that seem very relevant also for international operators, as an example of what's the exit to the supply glut, let's say. And then, because I want to just finish with Brazil, of course, after a long discussion, the Anvisa has finally approved a cultivation framework. Until now, all the products in Brazil were imported, with the exception of the associations, let's say non-profit patient associations in the market, which had been able under judicial authorization to grow for their members. But now the commercial cultivation has been approved in Brazil, which signals certainly some momentum also in the Latin American giant market, which is very exciting. Of course, we are in the low THC threshold for the most part, under 0.3 was determined, even though the tropical climates of some areas of Brazil could merit higher THC percentages, accounting for more variability, etc., etc. But at least there's a willingness to work with the industry. And the Anvisa director was looking at the news that claimed that he faced no opposition to developing these rules, contrary to, in most markets there tends to be always some prohibitionist voices against it. But in Brazil has made some progress, and we're going to be following the implementation. And that's it for today. I wanted to keep it to 30 minutes. So let's see if we have, I think we don't have any particular comment. If you want to read the full brief, you can subscribe in brief.cannamonitor.com, subscribe to our platform, and let us know in the comments if you want us to cover something else. We're going to be, next week, we have a webinar on the Czech market with Lucas Hurt. So we're really looking forward to seeing you there. And also we're going to be traveling to Paris for Cannabis Europa. So I look forward to connecting as well with the French industry. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a nice day.